The stars looked different through prison bars. Kang Do-hyun pressed his face against the cold metal and watched distant suns twinkle in the black space outside. 3 months ago, he had been tending crops on the colony ship Terra's Hope. Now, he sat in a cell on an alien prison station, surrounded by the sound of voices he could never make. The Velthian Empire ruled 17 star systems with an iron fist and golden voices. Their people believed that speech was power. The louder you could talk, the higher you ranked in their society. The Emperor himself could speak across space itself, his voice traveling between planets to give commands that no one could refuse. When the Velthians attacked Terra's Hope, they sorted the human prisoners by how well they could speak. The best speakers became house servants for noble families. Average speakers worked in factories. Poor speakers cleaned sewers and handled waste, but Do-hyun confused them completely. He could not speak at all. As a child on Earth, Do-hyun had been in an accident that damaged his throat. The doctors tried to fix it, but his voice never came back. His parents taught him to write and use hand signals. He learned to be clever with his hands instead of his voice. He became an engineer who could fix anything and grow food where nothing should grow. But the Velthians did not understand this. They had never met someone who could not speak. Their computers could not process what to do with him. Their guards did not know where to put him. Supreme Interrogator Vexathala was a tall woman with silver skin and eyes like black holes. She wore robes that seemed to move by themselves, and when she spoke, her voice could make people do things they did not want to do. She had broken 1,000 prisoners with her words alone. She tried everything on Do-hyun. She shouted at him. She whispered terrible things in his ear. She used her psychic voice to try to force him to scream. But Do-hyun just sat quietly and looked at her with calm brown eyes. Sometimes he would nod or shake his head to answer yes or no questions. Mostly he just waited. After 2 weeks, Vexathala gave up. She was frustrated and angry. How could she break someone who would not even try to speak? She sent Do-hyun to the null ward with a report that said simply, "Defective, cannot process." The null ward was where the Velthians put prisoners they considered worthless. It was a large section of the prison station filled with beings who had speech problems. Most aliens had never seen this place. The Velthians were ashamed of it and tried to pretend it did not exist. When the guards pushed Do-hyun through the heavy doors, he found himself in a wide room with dozens of other prisoners. Some were human. Many were alien species he had never seen before. All of them had one thing in common. They could not speak normally. Park Minji was a pilot from Terra's Hope. He had always struggled with stuttering, and the stress of capture had made it worse. Now he could barely get a word out without stopping, and starting several times. The Velthians had decided he was too difficult to listen to. Choi Yuna had been the terraforming specialist on their colony ship. An explosion during the attack had damaged her throat, and now she could only whisper. The Velthians said her voice was too weak to be worth anything. There was Jektar, a blue-skinned alien whose people communicated through musical tones. A disease had changed his voice so he could only make harsh croaking sounds. The Velthians found it ugly and annoying. Mothri was a tall, thin alien who came from a species that spoke very slowly and carefully. The Velthians had no patience for her measured way of talking and threw her in the null ward for being too boring. Lee Heji had been a language expert on Terra's Hope. She had studied alien communication for years. But she had selective mutism, which meant that stress and fear made it impossible for her to speak at all. In the null ward, she had not said a single word since arriving. The guards watched the null ward through cameras and sensors. They expected the prisoners to fight and cause trouble. Prisoners who could not speak properly should be angry and violent, they thought. They should attack each other and make chaos. Instead, something strange happened. Do-hyun walked slowly around the ward, looking at each prisoner carefully. He could see that they were scared and lonely. Many had injuries that were not being treated properly. Some were sick. Others were just sad and had given up hope. He started with small things. There was a water pipe that leaked and made the floor wet and slippery. Do-hyun found some spare metal and tools that had been left in a corner. He spent an afternoon fixing the pipe. He did not ask permission. He did not make announcements. He just fixed it. When the leak stopped, several prisoners came over to watch him work. They did not talk, but they held tools for him and helped move heavy pieces. By evening, the floor was dry for the first time in months. The next day, Do-hyun noticed that the food they were given was often spoiled or moldy. He started checking each meal carefully. He showed other prisoners which parts were safe to eat and which parts to avoid. Again, he did this without speaking. He just used his hands to point and gesture. Park Min-jae tried to say thank you, but his stuttering made it hard. Do-hyun smiled and shook his head. He pointed to his own throat and then made an X with his fingers. Min-jae understood. Do-hyun could not speak either. For the first time since his capture, Min-jae felt like he was not alone. Within a week, something unexpected was happening in the null ward. The prisoners were working together like parts of a machine. They shared food fairly. They helped each other stay clean and healthy. They took turns keeping watch and helping those who were sick, and they did it all without speaking. Do-hyun became the center of this quiet community, not because he gave orders, but because he solved problems. When the lights failed in one section, he fixed them. When someone was hurt, he knew how to help them heal. When food was scarce, he figured out how to make it last longer. The other prisoners began to copy his way of communicating. They used hand signals and gestures. They drew pictures on the walls. They found ways to share ideas without using voices. Guard Captain Kethmorn watched this through the security cameras. He had been in charge of the null ward for 5 years. Usually, the prisoners fought each other or sat alone in despair. He had never seen them cooperate like this. He reported to his commander, "The voiceless ones are acting strangely. They work together now. The human who cannot speak seems to be leading them, but he gives no orders that we can hear." His commander laughed. "Let them play their silent games. What harm can voiceless prisoners do? They are the weakest beings in the galaxy. They cannot even speak properly." But Kethmorn was not so sure. He kept watching the cameras, and what he saw made him uncomfortable. The prisoners moved like dancers who knew the same dance. They anticipated each other's needs. They solved problems faster than many of his own guards could. And at the center of it all was the quiet human who had never spoken a word, but somehow made everyone around him stronger. Do-hyun did not know that he was being watched so carefully. He just did what felt right. He helped where he could help. He fixed what was broken. He took care of people who needed care. But late at night, when the others were sleeping, he would look out through the bars at the stars and think about something he had noticed. The Valthians controlled their empire through their voices. Their psychic powers worked by making people respond to commands. But what if there were people who could not hear those commands? What if there were people who were immune to voice-based control simply because they lived in a world of silence? Do-hyun could not speak these thoughts, but they grew stronger in his mind each day. And slowly, very slowly, he began to realize that what the Valthian saw as his greatest weakness might actually be his greatest strength. 2 weeks had passed since Do-hyun first entered the null ward. The broken community of voiceless prisoners had become something new. They moved together like a school of fish, each person knowing where the others would be before they got there. Itu started with simple gestures. Do-hyun would point to something that needed fixing, and hands would appear with the right tools. He would touch his stomach when hungry, and someone would share their food. When he pointed to a sick prisoner, others would bring water and blankets. But gestures alone were not enough for complex ideas. Lee Hee-ji had been watching everything from a corner of the ward. Before her capture, she had spent years studying how different species communicated. She knew sign languages from Earth, gesture codes from Mars colonies, and even some alien forms of silent communication. One morning, she approached Do-hyun while he was repairing a broken air filter. She had not spoken since arriving at the prison, but now she began to move her hands in careful patterns. Her fingers danced through the air, creating shapes and movements that seemed to have meaning. Do-hyun watched carefully. He had learned some basic sign language as a child, but Hye-ji was doing something more complex. She was combining different systems, making something new. She pointed to herself, then made a sign with her hands. Then she pointed to the air filter and made different signs. Finally, she pointed to Do-hyun and waited. Do-hyun understood. She was teaching him a way to say, "I can help you fix this." He tried to copy her hand movements. His first attempt was clumsy, but Hyeji smiled and nodded. She showed him again, more slowly this time. Within an hour, they had created their first shared conversation without words. Other prisoners gathered around to watch. Park Min-jae, whose stuttering had gotten worse under stress, looked fascinated. Choi Yuna, who could only whisper, moved closer to see better. Hyeji began teaching them all. She started with simple concepts: hungry, thirsty, hurt, help, thank you. Each sign was clear and easy to remember, but she did not just teach Earth sign language. She watched how each prisoner naturally moved their hands and body, then incorporated those movements into their growing vocabulary. Jektar, the blue-skinned alien, had long, flexible fingers that could make shapes impossible for humans. Hyeji created special signs that used his unique anatomy. Mothri, the tall alien who spoke slowly, had graceful arm movements that became part of their system for expressing complex ideas. Kim Tae-won was a human mechanic who had been born without the ability to speak. He had spent his whole life working with his hands, and those hands were incredibly skilled. When Hyeji taught him the new sign language, he picked it up faster than anyone else. Soon he was creating new signs for mechanical terms and showing others how to describe repairs and maintenance. Song Nari was different from the others. She was a young human woman who had stopped speaking after witnessing terrible things during the attack on their ship. She did not use the sign language much, but she began drawing on the walls with pieces of charcoal she found. Her drawings were amazing. She could capture the layout of the prison with perfect detail. She drew maps showing where the guards walked, when they changed shifts, and which areas had the best hiding spots. She drew portraits of prisoners that were so accurate they looked like photographs. Do-hyun realized that Nari's drawings were another form of communication. Her pictures could share information that would take hundreds of signs to explain. He began working with her to create a system where drawings and sign language worked together. The language grew every day. Soon they had signs for emotions, for plans, for memories of home. They had ways to describe complex engineering problems and simple human needs. Most importantly, they had ways to show care and support for each other. Guard Captain Keith Morn continued to watch through the security cameras. What he saw disturbed him more each day. The prisoners were not just cooperating, they were becoming a single organism with many parts. When one prisoner got sick, the others would take care of them without any apparent discussion. When work needed to be done, the right people would appear with the right skills at exactly the right time. When food was distributed, everyone got their fair share without any arguments or fighting. "This is not normal," Kethmorn reported to his commander. "Prisoners should compete with each other. They should fight over food and resources. These ones share everything." His commander, a large Velthian with a voice like thunder, was not worried. "They are defective beings, Captain. Let them play their silent games. When we need them for hard labor, we will simply order them to work. They will obey like all prisoners do." But Kethmorn noticed something that his commander missed. When Velthian guards gave orders to prisoners in the null ward, something strange happened. The prisoners would look at the guards with blank faces. They would tilt their heads slightly as if listening to something far away. Then they would look at each other, make quick hand signs, and decide together what to do. Sometimes they obeyed the orders. Sometimes they did not. But their decision never seemed to depend on the authority or volume of the guard's voice. This worried Kethmorn greatly. In Velthian society, disobeying a direct vocal command was almost impossible. Their psychic voices could compel obedience from any thinking being. But these prisoners seemed immune to that power. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the null ward. Prisoners from other sections began to notice the peace and cooperation in the voiceless area. Some began to visit during exercise periods or work assignments. Bai Jiwan had been classified as a third-tier speaker when she was captured. This meant she could talk normally, but not with the beauty and power that Velthians admired. She worked in the prison kitchens, preparing food for guards and higher-ranked prisoners. During her work, she often passed by the null ward. She saw how the voiceless prisoners helped each other and shared everything they had. She saw how peaceful they looked, even in prison. One day, when a guard was being particularly cruel to her, screaming orders and insults, Bae-ji-won made a decision. She stopped talking back. She stopped defending herself with words. She just listened to the abuse in silence, then walked away. That evening, she approached the null ward during exercise time. Do-hyun was teaching a group of alien prisoners how to fix a water recycler. When he saw her, he nodded in greeting. Bae-ji-won opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it. She pointed to herself, then to the group of prisoners learning signs. She was asking if she could join them. Do-hyun smiled and nodded. Hye-ji came over and began teaching Bae-ji-won the basic signs. Within minutes, the Korean woman was learning to speak with her hands instead of her voice. That night, Bae-ji-won made another decision. She would stop using her voice entirely. She would join the community of the voluntarily silent. She was not the only one. Over the following days, more prisoners began to choose silence. They had seen how the voiceless ones lived in harmony and mutual support. They wanted to be part of that community. The Velthian guards noticed that fewer prisoners were responding to their vocal commands. More and more inmates would just look at them silently, make hand gestures to each other, and then act based on their own group decisions. Kethmorn requested a meeting with the Supreme Interrogator. Vexathala had been busy breaking prisoners in other sections, but the guard captain's report made her pause. "You are telling me that prisoners are choosing not to speak," she said, her voice carrying dangerous undertones. "Yes, Supreme Interrogator. And when they choose silence, our vocal commands seem to have no effect on them." Vexathala was quiet for a long moment. In 3 centuries of interrogation, she had never encountered beings who were immune to psychic voice control. The idea was impossible. "Bring me this silent human," she ordered. "The one who started this madness. I will make him speak if I have to tear the words from his throat." But deep in the null ward, Do-hyun continued his quiet work. He fixed broken things, helped sick people, and taught others how to communicate without words. He did not know that he had become the most dangerous prisoner in Velthian space. He only knew that for the first time in his life, being unable to speak felt like a superpower rather than a disability. And around him, a community was growing that might just change everything. The plan began with a single drawing on the wall. Song Nari had sketched the prison's power grid, showing every wire and connection point. She drew arrows pointing to weak spots where a few cuts could disable entire sections. Her artistic hands had mapped their cage better than any blueprint. Do-hyun studied the drawing while eating his morning meal. Around him, 200 prisoners moved in perfect silence, each one part of a growing organism that thought with many minds, but spoke with no voices. The null ward had become something the Velthians never expected, a place where weakness had become strength. Oh Sung-min had been a soldier before the capture. Shrapnel from the attack on Terra's Hope had torn through his throat, stealing his voice but leaving his tactical mind sharp as ever. When he saw Nari's drawings, he understood immediately what Do-hyun was thinking. Sung-min moved his hands in quick, precise patterns. Military sign language mixed with the new system Hye-ji had created. His message was clear. We can take this place. For 3 days they planned in absolute silence. Every detail was worked out through hand signals, drawings, and careful movements. Guards watched through cameras but saw nothing unusual. Prisoners eating together, working on small repairs, helping each other with daily tasks. Nothing that looked like rebellion planning. Kim Tae-wan, the mechanic who had been mute since birth, took charge of disabling the prison's systems. His hands spoke a language of gears and circuits that needed no words. He showed others which tools to gather, which panels to open, which wires to cut. All of it communicated through gestures and sketches. Lim Soo-young had been a music teacher on Terra's Hope. The attack had damaged her voice, but her understanding of sound and vibration remained perfect. She discovered that the Velthian psychic communication system relied on specific frequencies. Using pieces of metal and improvised instruments, she could create sounds that interfered with their telepathic control. Yoon-haran was deaf from birth, but had been the best computer programmer on their colony ship. She could read the prison's digital systems like a book written in her native language. Working with Jiang Wusong, a young man with autism who saw patterns others missed, she began mapping the station's computer network. The breakthrough came when Wusong noticed that the central AI responded to mathematical sequences. Binary code could be tapped out on walls, transmitted through vibrations in the metal structure. For the first time, they had a way to communicate directly with the prison's brain. On the night of the escape, everything happened at once. Tehwan's teams moved through maintenance shafts, cutting power to guard stations and camera systems. Their hands worked in perfect coordination, each person knowing exactly which task was theirs. 20 years of prison security disabled in 20 minutes, all without a single spoken word. So-young positioned herself near the communication arrays. Her improvised instruments began creating harmonic interference that made the Vielthian guards dizzy and confused. Their psychic voices, normally clear and commanding, became fuzzy and weak. Heron and Wusong took control of the computer systems. Binary sequences tapped against walls opened doors throughout the prison. Environmental controls shifted to create confusion. Lights flickered in patterns that guided escaped prisoners while blinding guards. Seungmin led combat teams using hand signals with military precision. They moved like ghosts through corridors, appearing where guards didn't expect them and vanishing before alarms could be raised. No battle cries, no shouted orders, just silent efficiency that was more terrifying than any war scream. The Vielthian guards found themselves fighting an enemy they could not understand. Every time they tried to use their psychic voices to command obedience, the rebels simply looked at them with blank expressions and continued their work. It was as if the prisoners could not hear the compulsion that should have stopped them immediately. Guard. Captain Kethmorn ran through hallways that had become alien to him. Emergency lights cast red shadows while alarms screamed uselessly at enemies who fought in silence. He spoke into his communicator, trying to coordinate a response, but his guards reported the same thing from every sector. They don't respond to commands, Captain. We tell them to stop and they just look at us. We use full psychic compulsion and they act like they can't hear us. Supreme Interrogator. Vexathala had been sleeping when the escape began. She woke to chaos unlike anything in her 3 centuries of experience. Prisoners who should have been cowering in cells were moving through her station like they owned it. Her most powerful weapon, the voice that could break any will, seemed useless against them. She found Do Yun in the central computer core. He was working alongside Heron to unlock the final security protocols that would give them complete control of the station. When Vexathala entered, he looked up calmly and nodded, as if greeting an old friend. "You will stop this madness," she commanded, putting the full power of her psychic voice behind the words. The sound waves carried compulsion that should have dropped him to his knees in obedience. Do-hyun tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something far away. Then he smiled sadly and shook his head. He pointed to his throat and made an X with his fingers. The gesture was gentle, almost apologetic. Vexathala tried again, pouring more power into her voice. The psychic energy filled the room like invisible fire. Any normal being would have been overwhelmed, forced to obey regardless of their own will. But Do-hyun just continued working on the computer console. His movements were calm and purposeful. He acted like her voice was just another sound in the background, no more important than the hum of machinery. For the first time in her life, Vexathala felt powerless. She had broken the wills of entire planets with her voice. She had made kings, kneel, and armies surrender. But this quiet human engineer seemed to exist in a world where her greatest strength simply did not matter. The rebellion spread beyond the silent prisoners. Throughout the station, speaking prisoners witnessed something impossible, beings who were immune to Vielthian control. Some joined immediately, laying down their voices to become part of the silent army. Nam Ji-hoon had cerebral palsy that made his speech difficult to understand. The Vielthians had classified him as barely functional, good only for the simplest manual labor. But when the escape began, he showed skills they had never imagined. His different way of thinking allowed him to solve logistical problems that stopped others. Soon he was coordinating resource distribution for hundreds of escaped prisoners. Shin, Mikyung had lost her voice to cancer treatments on Earth. The Vaelthians had assigned her to waste disposal, thinking her worthless. But she had been a doctor before her illness, and her medical knowledge became crucial as guards and prisoners were injured in the fighting. Her gentle hands spoke healing in a language that needed no words. By dawn, the impossible had happened. The prison station belonged to its former prisoners. Vaelthian guards were locked in their own cells, still unable to understand how their psychic commands had failed so completely. But the rebels had made a choice that surprised everyone, including themselves. They had not tried to escape. Instead of fleeing to distant planets, they had turned the prison into something new, a place where every being had value regardless of their ability to speak. Park Min-jae, whose stuttering had made him worthless, in Vaelthian eyes became their coordinator for communications with other prison stations. His patience with difficult speech helped him connect with prisoners throughout the empire who had similar struggles. Choi Yuna, who could only whisper, took charge of their growing agricultural projects. Her soft voice became a symbol of gentle strength that drew others to the cause of silent resistance. The transformation was complete when they received their first communication from the Vaelthian capital. Emperor Korthval himself was demanding to speak with whoever led this rebellion. The message was broadcast throughout the station. The Emperor's voice carried power that had toppled governments and conquered star systems. His psychic presence filled every corner of the prison, demanding immediate surrender. 200 former prisoners stood in the main hall and listened to their Emperor's commands. Then as one, they looked at each other and began moving their hands in silent conversation. They were discussing the Emperor's demands like any other problem that needed solving. When they had reached a decision, Do-hyun stepped forward. He looked directly into the communication screen where the Emperor's image glowed with barely contained rage. Very slowly and clearly, Do-hyun mouthed a single word that every Vaelthian could read on his lips. No. The sound of that silence echoed across the galaxy, and an empire built on the power of voice began to tremble. Emperor Korthval had ruled the galaxy for 300 years. His voice could travel across light years and make entire planets obey his commands. He had never been told no by anyone, and he had certainly never been told no by someone who could not even speak. The Emperor's flagship arrived at the prison station within days. It was a massive ship that looked like a floating palace, covered in gold and silver that reflected the light of nearby stars. When it docked with the station, the sound of its engines made the walls shake. Korthval came aboard with his full court. Advisors in flowing robes walked behind him, their voices creating a harmony that made lesser beings feel calm and obedient. Admiral Zeftaran, the Emperor's military commander, brought a full company of elite guards whose vocal commands could stop a charging army. They expected to find chaos. They expected to find broken prisoners begging for forgiveness. Instead, they found something that made no sense at all. The prison had become a functioning society. Former prisoners worked together on projects that improved life for everyone. Gardens grew in areas that had been empty storage rooms. Workshops hummed with activity as beings from different species shared knowledge and skills. Oh Sung-min, the former soldier who had lost his voice, was teaching other prisoners tactical planning, using only hand signals and diagrams. His lessons were so clear that aliens who had never seen human military strategy were learning advanced combat techniques. Nam Ji-hoon, whose cerebral palsy made his speech difficult, had become the coordinator for resource distribution. His different way of thinking had created a system where nothing was wasted and everyone got what they needed. The Emperor watched in confusion as dozens of beings followed the directions of someone his empire would have considered mentally defective. Shin, Mi-kyung, the doctor who had lost her voice to cancer, ran a medical center that was treating injuries and illnesses better than many official Vaelthian hospitals. Her gentle hands and patient care had saved lives that the Empire would have written off as worthless. But most shocking of all was how they treated their former captors. The Vaelthian guards who had been locked up during the rebellion were not being tortured or killed. Instead, they were being cared for like any other prisoners. They received food, medical care, and were even being taught the sign language that had become the common communication method. Some of the younger guards had started learning it eagerly. They seemed fascinated by the idea of communication that did not depend on vocal dominance or psychic compulsion. Emperor Korthval walked through the station in growing bewilderment. His advisors whispered frantically behind him, trying to explain what they were seeing. But their explanations made no sense. "Perhaps they are pretending, Your Majesty," suggested one advisor. "This could be an elaborate deception to make us lower our guard. Or maybe they have developed immunity to our psychic voices through some kind of scientific experiment," offered another. Admiral Zeph Terran had a simpler explanation. "They are clearly defective beings who cannot understand proper authority. We should destroy this station and all its inhabitants before their madness spreads further." But Korthval was not convinced by any of these theories. He had seen rebels before. He had crushed uprisings and destroyed resistance movements across 17 star systems. This was something entirely different. These prisoners were not acting like defeated enemies trying to trick him. They were not behaving like rebels plotting his downfall. They were simply living their lives as if his empire and its rules did not matter to them at all. The Emperor demanded to meet with their leader. His advisors assumed this would be some charismatic speaker who had somehow learned to resist psychic compulsion. They prepared for a battle of voices, a contest of wills between the Emperor and whoever had organized this impossible rebellion. Instead, they were brought to a workshop where Do-Yun was teaching a group of mixed species how to repair atmospheric processors. The quiet human looked up when they entered, nodded politely, and returned to his work. "This is him," reported Guard Captain Kethmorn, who had been released from prison to serve as a guide. "This is the one who started everything." Korthval stared at the man who had somehow defied his entire empire. Do-Hyun was not impressive to look at. He was of average height and build, with work-calloused hands and simple clothes. Nothing about him suggested the power to challenge galactic authority. "You will explain yourself," the Emperor commanded, putting the full force of his psychic voice behind the words. The sound filled the room like thunder, carrying compulsion that should have made Do-Hyun fall to his knees in submission. Do-Hyun looked up from his work again. He tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something far away. Then he smiled, sadly, and touched his throat. He made the same X gesture with his fingers that he had shown to so many others. One of the Emperor's advisors whispered frantically, "He cannot speak, Your Majesty. That is why our commands do not affect him. He exists outside the realm of vocal communication entirely." But Korthval was not satisfied with this explanation. He had encountered mute beings before, and his psychic voice could still compel obedience from them. There was something different about this human, something that made him immune to control in a way the Emperor had never experienced. Do-Hyun set down his tools and approached the Emperor. His movements were calm and unthreatening, but several guards reached for their weapons anyway. The human stopped a few feet away and began moving his hands in the sign language that had become common throughout the station. "He says he is sorry you have come so far for nothing," translated Park Min-jae, who had been serving as an interpreter. "He says you are welcome to stay and learn, but he cannot give you what you want." "And what is it that I want?" the Emperor demanded. Do-Hyun's hands moved again. "He says you want him to be afraid of your voice, but he has never been afraid of voices because he has never lived in a world where voices have power over him. He says he is sorry, but he cannot pretend to be something he is not." The Emperor felt something he had not experienced in centuries, frustration mixed with genuine curiosity. This being was not defying him out of rebellion or hatred. He simply existed in a reality where the Emperor's greatest power was meaningless. Over the following days, something unprecedented happened. Instead of destroying the station or taking the prisoners back into custody, Emperor Korthval stayed to observe. He watched as Park Seung-hee, a human child who had chosen silence after witnessing her parents' death during the attack, drew pictures that showed her memories and dreams. Her art spoke of pain and healing in ways that words never could. He saw how Lee Damon, a poet who expressed himself entirely through sign language, created beauty that moved people to tears without making a single sound. He observed Choi Yuna, teaching alien species how to grow food in environments that should have been impossible for agriculture. Her whispered instructions were more effective than shouted commands, because people had to lean close and pay attention to hear them. Most disturbing of all, he watched his own guards beginning to change. The younger ones especially seemed drawn to this world where communication was based on attention and care, rather than dominance and compulsion. One evening, the Emperor found himself alone with Do-yun in the station's observation deck. They stood, side by side, looking out at the stars through the large windows. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Korthval broke the silence. "I have conquered 17 star systems with my voice," he said quietly. "I have made kings kneel and armies surrender, but I cannot make you acknowledge my authority." Do-yun turned to look at him. Very slowly, he took out a piece of paper and wrote something on it. He handed it to the Emperor. The message was simple. "I acknowledge that you have great power, but power over others has never been the same thing as strength within yourself. You do not need me to fear you for you to be worthy of respect." The Emperor stared at the words for a long time. "How do you know I am worthy of respect if you do not fear my power?" Do-yun wrote another note. "Because you came here to understand instead of simply destroying what you could not control. Because you are still here, trying to learn. That takes a different kind of strength." That night, Emperor Korthval had dreams unlike any he had experienced before. He dreamed of a galaxy where beings cooperated instead of competed, where problems were solved through understanding rather than force, where the strongest voices were the ones that knew when to be silent. When he woke, he made a decision that would change the course of history. He would not destroy the prison station. Instead, he would learn from it. And across the galaxy, other prison stations and slave worlds began to hear whispers of something impossible. A place where the voiceless had found power and where an emperor had begun to listen. The change began with a single young Velthian who had never spoken loudly enough to matter. Koventh was the emperor's distant cousin, born with a voice so weak that he barely qualified for the lowest noble rank. All his life, he had been ashamed of his quiet words and hesitant speech. In Velthian society, he was almost worthless. But curiosity about the impossible prison drew him to visit in secret. He arrived expecting to see chaos and rebellion. Instead, he found Do-hyun in the engineering section, teaching a mixed group of aliens how to build better water recycling systems. The lesson was conducted entirely without words. Do-hyun would point to parts and demonstrate connections. Students would try the techniques themselves and get gentle corrections through hand gestures. When someone succeeded, Do-hyun would smile and nod approval. Koventh watched for hours. For the first time in his life, he saw learning that did not depend on having a strong voice or being able to speak over others. Knowledge was shared through patience and demonstration, not through vocal dominance. When the lesson ended, Do-hyun noticed the young Vaelthian standing in the doorway. He approached slowly and made welcoming gestures. He pointed to himself, then to the workbench, then to Koventh. The meaning was clear. Would you like to learn too? Koventh had never been invited to participate in anything important before. His weak voice meant that others rarely listened to his ideas or took his contributions seriously. But here was someone offering to teach him based only on his willingness to learn. He nodded and stepped forward. For the next 3 hours, Do-hyun taught Koventh basic engineering principles. The lesson required no speaking at all. Everything was communicated through careful demonstration, patient repetition, and shared work on actual problems. By the end of the day, Koventh had successfully repaired a broken air filtration unit. It was the first time in his life that he had completed something important without needing to explain himself through words or prove his worth through vocal ability. When he returned to the capital city, Koventh carried something revolutionary: the knowledge that value could exist beyond voice. He began sharing this idea quietly with other weak-voiced Velthians. There were more of them than anyone realized, people who had been pushed to the edges of society because their words did not carry enough power or beauty to matter. Word spread through whispered conversations and secret meetings. Soon, dozens of Velthians were making pilgrimages to the prison station, seeking to learn from the community that had found strength in silence. Emperor Korthval noticed the changes in his empire. Reports arrived from across 17 star systems describing unusual behavior among the lower classes. Slaves were working together more efficiently. Weak-voiced citizens were organizing community projects. Most disturbing of all, some beings were choosing to stop speaking entirely. The Emperor returned to the prison station seeking answers. He found Do-hyun in the garden section, working alongside aliens from 6 different species to grow food in what had once been empty storage areas. This time, Korthval came alone. He left his advisors and guards behind, bringing only his questions and his growing confusion about what he was witnessing. "My empire is changing," he told Do-hyun, who looked up from the tomato plants he was tending. "Beings throughout the galaxy are learning your silent language. They are organizing without waiting for vocal commands. Some are refusing to respond to psychic compulsion entirely." Do-hyun set down his gardening tools and pulled out a piece of paper. He wrote, "Change is like water. It finds every crack and flows where it needs to go. We did not try to change your empire. We only tried to survive and help each other." The Yas-E Emperor read the note twice. "But survival and mutual aid should not be able to resist the power of organized authority. My voice can compel obedience across star systems. How do you resist what has controlled the galaxy for centuries?" Do-hyun wrote again, "We do not resist your voice. We simply live in a place where voices like yours have never had meaning. It is not rebellion. It is just a different way of being alive." That afternoon, something unprecedented happened. Emperor Korthval asked Do-hyun to teach him how to work with his hands instead of his voice. They started with simple repairs in the station's maintenance areas. The Emperor, who had never done manual labor in 3 centuries of life, learned to fix broken pipes and adjust machinery. Do-hyun taught him through demonstration and patient guidance, never needing to speak a word. For the first time, Korthval experienced the satisfaction of solving problems through direct action, rather than commanding others to solve them for him. His hands, which had only known the gestures of authority, learned the movements of creation and repair. Lee Damon, the poet who spoke through sign language, began teaching the Emperor how thoughts could be expressed through movement instead of sound. The beauty of silent poetry amazed Korthval, who had never imagined that meaning could be conveyed so elegantly without vocal power. Go Yejin, whose damaged throat produced only whispers, showed him how quiet words could carry more impact than loud commands. When people had to lean close to hear her, they paid attention in ways they never did when someone shouted at them. Over weeks of learning, the Emperor began to understand something that shook the foundation of his worldview. The Velthian Empire had been built on the assumption that vocal power was the highest form of strength. But here was a community that had found different kinds of power entirely. They had the power of cooperation without compulsion. They had the strength that came from choosing to work together rather than being forced to obey. They had discovered that problems could be solved more effectively through patient collaboration than through authoritarian commands. Most importantly, they had learned that every being had value regardless of their ability to speak beautifully or loudly. The transformation accelerated when the Emperor made his decision public. In a broadcast across all 17 star systems, Korthval announced the establishment of silent councils in every major city. These would be governing bodies where problems were solved through collaborative thinking rather than vocal dominance. Lee Hyeji, the linguist who had developed the sign language system, became the first ambassador to worlds seeking to join this new form of governance. Her diplomatic missions were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Instead of negotiating through threats and vocal pressure, she taught entire planetary governments how to communicate through patient listening and mutual understanding. Park Min-jae, whose stuttering had once made him worthless in Velthian eyes, established the first intersystem communication network. based on written messages and visual signals rather than vocal commands. Planets that had been isolated by language barriers suddenly found ways to share knowledge and resources. Shin Mik-young, the doctor who could not speak above a whisper, founded medical schools that taught healing through careful observation and gentle touch rather than authoritative diagnosis. Her methods proved more effective than traditional Velthian medicine, which had been based on commanding bodies to heal rather than understanding what they needed. The changes were not without resistance. Many traditional Velthians could not accept a galaxy where vocal ability no longer determined worth. Some attempted counter-rebellions trying to restore the old order through force, but their efforts failed in ways they could not understand. The silent communities did not fight back with violence or competing voices. Instead, they simply chose not to respond to vocal commands, making the traditional weapons of control useless. Admiral Zeftarin led the largest attempt to restore vocal authority. He brought a fleet of warships to the prison station, intending to destroy the source of the silent infection once and for all. But when his ships arrived, they found something impossible. The station was surrounded by vessels from across the galaxy, all flying flags that showed hands joined in the universal sign for cooperation. Beings from hundreds of species had come to protect the community that had taught them new ways of living together. Faced with this unprecedented show of voluntary unity, Zeftarin found his vocal commands powerless. His own crew began to question orders that would require them to attack beings who had never threatened anyone with violence. The Admiral's flagship eventually joined the protective fleet, and Zeftarin himself learned to communicate through the sign language that had become the galaxy's second universal tongue. Years passed. The Velthian Empire still existed, but it had become something entirely different. Vocal ability remained important, but it was now just one of many valued traits rather than the sole measure of worth. Planets across 17 star systems developed their own versions of silent councils and collaborative governance. Problems that had seemed impossible to solve through authoritarian command were resolved through patient cooperation and diverse perspectives. The former prison station became a university, where beings from across the galaxy came to learn new forms of communication and cooperation. Students arrived speaking dozens of different languages and left able to understand each other through methods that transcended words. Do-Yun never became emperor or even held any official title. He remained what he had always been, an engineer who fixed broken things and helped people solve problems.